How do we get from a lawyer blogging about, potholes and oil stocks in Moscow to a man allegedly being targeted with a rare Amazonian neurotoxin inside a maximum security prison in the Arctic?
It is a tragic arc, but a fascinating one from a geopolitical standpoint. It's the story of a personal rivalry that became so intense, so obsessive, that one side allegedly reached across the globe to find a weapon that, in their minds, couldn't be traced.
Let's zoom out. Because to understand why a state would allegedly go to the trouble of sourcing or synthesizing Amazonian frog poison, we have to understand the threat Navalny posed. He wasn't always this global symbol of democracy.
No, and that's a crucial point. If we rewind the clock, he didn't start as a revolutionary waving a flag. He started essentially as a forensic accountant.
A nerd with a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
I love this part of his story because it's so mundane, yet so effective. The minority shareholder era, this is back in, what, roughly 2008?
Right. Navalny was a lawyer with degrees in law and finance. The Russian economy was booming due to high oil prices, but there was also massive systemic graft.
Okay.
And Navalny realized that Russia's biggest companies, state-controlled giants like Rosneft, Gazprom, the big banks, were publicly traded. So he started buying tiny amounts of shares.
Just enough to get a ticket to the annual meeting.
Exactly. He wasn't trying to take over the company. He just wanted the right to stand up in the annual general meeting, hold up a piece of paper and say, "Excuse me, I'm looking at the audit here. Why did we buy drilling pipes for the East Siberian pipeline at 300% of the market value through a shell company in Cyprus?"
That is such a specific, damaging way to attack a regime. It's not ideological, it's mathematical.
It's what you might call weaponized transparency. And he didn't just ask the questions in the room. He published the receipts on his blog. This was the birth of his organization, Rospil,
Waspil.
which is a play on the Russian word for sawing, as in sawing off a chunk of the budget for yourself.
The Russians saw. That's great branding.
It was brilliant branding. He turned corruption into a meme before memes were really a thing. He showed that the money wasn't just vanishing, it was buying yachts and villas for the elite.
And this is where he coined that phrase that really stuck. I feel like every Russian knows this phrase, regardless of their politics.
The party of crooks and thieves. He used it to describe United Russia, Putin's ruling party. And it resonated because it wasn't abstract. He wasn't talking about freedom in a philosophical sense. He was saying, they're stealing your money.
Right.
He claimed 1 trillion rubles were being embezzled annually.
So he goes from being a financial annoyance to a political problem, and this leads to the mass protests in 2011, the Bolotnaya Square era.
Correct. That was the turning point. When tens of thousands of people took to the streets chanting his slogans, the dynamic shifted. It stopped being about money and started being about power.
Yeah.
And specifically, it became a personal rivalry with Vladimir Putin.
I want to double-click on that personal aspect, because you've mentioned before how Putin treated Navalny differently than other critics. There was a weird psychological game being played.
It's often called the Voldemort treatment.
He who must not be named.
Quite literally.
Mhm.
If you look at the transcripts of Putin's press conferences over the last decade of Navalny's life, Putin almost never spoke Navalny's name. He would call him that character, a certain person, the blogger, or the defendant.
Wow.
It was a deliberate attempt to deny him status. By not naming him, he was trying to signal that this man does not exist on my level.
But that character managed to run for mayor of Moscow in 2013, and this feels like the last time the system actually let him play the game.
It was a massive miscalculation by the Kremlin. They let him run, likely thinking he'd get crushed and humiliated, which would end his career.
And they barred him from state TV.
Zero airtime. But Navalny ran a Western-style grassroots campaign. He was in the subway stations, shaking hands, holding rallies on wooden crates.
And he got almost 30% of the vote.
27.2% officially. Yeah. And that terrified the establishment. It proved that his message had traction beyond just the internet bubble. If he could get nearly a third of the vote in the Capitol with one hand tied behind his back, what could he do in a fair fight?
So they realized, okay, we can't. We absolutely cannot let him run for anything ever again.
Essentially, yes. The drawbridge came up, but Navalny adapted. This is where we have to talk about his smart voting strategy.
Right. Explain how that worked, because it wasn't about voting for Navalny since he wasn't on the ballot.
Exactly. It was a tactical voting app. Navalny's team would analyze every district and tell voters, okay, in your district, the communist candidate has the best chance of beating the United Russia guy. Vote for the communist.
So it didn't matter who it was.
It didn't matter if the communist was terrible. The goal was simply to break the monopoly of the ruling party.
Hmm.
It was pure chaos for the Kremlin's political managers.
It's incredibly disruptive. But the biggest disruption, the one that really seemed to make things personal, was the video investigation released in January 2021, Putin's palace.
That video was a cultural phenomenon. It dropped right after Navalny was arrested upon his return to Russia. It was a 2-hour deep dive into a billion-dollar palace on the Black Sea, allegedly built for Putin with illicit funds.
I remember watching that. It was the details that got people. The hookah lounge, the aqua disco, the Italian toilet brushes that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary.
It was viral gold. It got over 100 million views. But more importantly, it attacked Putin's personal reputation. It didn't attack his policy on NATO or tax rates. It painted him as a greedy emperor who is out of touch with regular Russians.
Right.
For an autocrat who relies on an image of strength and austerity, that is a dangerous thing to do.
And doing that, well, that brings us to the poisonings. Because we can't talk about the frog toxin in 2026 without talking about the nerve agent in 2020. This wasn't the first attempt.
No, this is the prequel, August 2020.
Navalny is on a plane from Tomsk to Moscow. He's campaigning, and he just starts screaming in agony.
He collapses. Now, the only reason he survived is because the pilot made an emergency landing in Omsk, and the ambulance crew on the ground acted fast with atropine.
They treated the symptoms.
Immediately.
Hmm.
If that plane had continued to Moscow, or if the medics had hesitated, he would have died then.
And later, German labs identified the agent as Novichok.
Yes, a Soviet-era military-grade nerve agent. This is a chemical weapon banned by international law.
But the craziest part of the 2020 story, and I think this is the moment that really cemented his legend, is what happened after he woke up in Germany. He didn't just issue a statement, he did detective work.
The prank call. It's almost hard to believe it happened.
Wait, walk us through this, because I always forget the specifics. He actually called the guy himself.
He did. He was recovering in Berlin, working with Bellingcat investigators. They identified the FSB team that had trailed him.
Okay.
Navalny used software to disguise his phone number, so it looked like it was coming from FSB headquarters. He called one of the agents, a chemist named Konstantin Kundryavtsev, at 7 a.m.
And he pretends to be an aide to a high-ranking general.
He pretends to be an aide needing a report on why the mission failed. And because Kundryavtsev thinks he's talking to a superior, and because he's caught off guard early in the morning, he talks.
He spills everything.
For 49 minutes. Navalny asks, where was the concentration highest? And Kundryavtsev explains that they applied the poison to the inner seams of Navalny's underwear.
The underwear.
Specifically the codpiece area.
The blue boxer shorts. I mean, can you imagine? You are a feared dictator, you have this scary spy agency, and your top assassin gets prank called by the victim and admits he put poison in his underwear.
He was humiliating.
Yeah.
Navalny mocked Putin in court later, calling him Vladimir the Underpants Poisoner.
Right.
He contrasted it with historical figures like Yaroslav the Wise or Alexander the Liberator. He stripped away the fear and replaced it with laughter. And for a strongman leader, being laughed at is unforgivable.
And yet, and this is the part that I think people still struggle to understand, he went back, he was safe in Germany, he had his family, he knew he would be arrested the second he landed. But in January 2021, he got on that plane. Why?
It's a question that historians will debate for a long time. But looking at it through the lens of Russian history, it makes a kind of sense. He said he never left. He felt that staying in exile would make him irrelevant, just another emigre shouting from the outside.
It's a very Russian concept, isn't it? The idea that to have moral authority, you have to suffer with your people.
Absolutely. It echoes Solzhenitsyn or Dostoevsky. He wanted to show that he wasn't afraid. It was a move of immense moral courage or perhaps recklessness, depending on how you view it. But he landed, and he was immediately detained.
And he never walked free again.
Never.
So let's talk about those final years. Because the conditions he faced were brutal, even by Russian prison standards.
They were designed to break him physically and mentally. He was moved from a standard colony to a strict regime, and finally to IK3, the polar wolf colony.
That sounds like a villain's lair name.
It essentially is. It's in Karp, in the Yamalo-Nenets region, above the Arctic Circle. It was built on the foundations of the old Gulag system. The conditions are extreme perpetual winter, isolation.
And they kept him in the shiso, the punishment cell.
Repeatedly. For minor infractions, an unbuttoned collar, washing his face at the wrong time, they would throw him in a tiny concrete cell. No bed during the day, no books, freezing cold, minimal food.
My God.
He spent hundreds of days in there. It destroys your health.
But even then, he didn't shut up. The war in Ukraine started in 2022 while he was inside.
And he was vocal about it. He called it a stupid war built on a bloodthirsty obsession. He tried to turn his court appearances into anti-war rallies. He was urging the West to sanction the oligarchs.
Which brings us to the end. February 16th, 2024, the day he died.
The official story from the prison service was that he went for a walk, felt unwell, lost consciousness, and died almost instantly.
Which nobody in his circle believed for a second.
His widow, Yulia Navalnaya, accused Putin immediately. She said he was killed, and there was this heartbreaking detail that emerged later. His team claimed he was on the verge of being swapped.
Right, the prisoner exchange theory. This is a crucial context.
Reports surfaced that negotiations were in the final stages to swap Navalny and 2 U.S. citizens for Vadim Krasikov.
And Krasikov was the FSB hitman imprisoned in Germany for shooting a Chechen dissident in a park in Berlin.
Correct. Putin wanted Krasikov back desperately. He called him a patriot. The theory goes that once Putin got the signal that the West was willing to trade Krasikov, he decided he could get his hitman back without giving up his biggest enemy.
So the theory is, the swap is on the table. Putin decides no way and orders the hit.
That's the theory. As one ally put it, Navalny was never going to be allowed to leave.
And now, with this 2026 report, we have the forensic backing for Yulia's claim. The biological samples show the epibetadine.
It validates the murder theory, and it points to a method of killing that is both exotic and cruel.
So let's dive into the 2026 forensic bombshell, as the papers are calling it.
The core of the finding rests on biological samples, hair, blood, and tissue, that were reportedly smuggled out of Russia shortly after Navalny's death in February 2024.
Smuggled out.
Yeah. The report states these samples were subjected to advanced mass spectrometry, and they found distinct traces of epibetadine. Now, this is a substance secreted by the Epipetabates anthonii, also known as Anthony's poison arrow frog.
Okay, I have to ask the obvious question here, just to clear the deck. Is there any chance this was accidental? Does these frogs even exist in the Russian wild?
That's the first thing the investigators looked at. And the answer is a definitive no. These frogs are endemic to a very small range in the tropical dry forests of Ecuador and Peru.
Okay.
They require a warm, humid climate. They definitely do not live in the Yamalo-Nadets region of the Russian Arctic, where temperatures regularly drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius.
So it didn't just hop into his cell through a window?
No. But here is the scientific detail that really points to a sophisticated actor rather than some random accident.
Go on.
In the wild, these frogs produce the toxin because of their diet. They eat specific beetles and millipedes in that Amazonian environment that contain the precursor chemicals.
Uh-huh.
If you take that frog and put it in a terrarium in a zoo, or breed it in captivity without that specific diet, it doesn't produce the poison. It becomes harmless.
That's fascinating. So you can't just buy one at an exotic pet store and hope for the best.
Exactly. To acquire lethal quantities of epibetadine, you have two options. One, you harvest it from thousands of wild frogs in Ecuador, which is logistical madness.
Yeah.
Or two, you synthesize it in a high-tech laboratory. The report notes that this requires serious organic chemistry capabilities. It actually cites intelligence suggesting that Russian state laboratories were experimenting with synthesizing this exact toxin as far back as 2013.
And what does this stuff do to a human body? Why choose this over, say, cyanide?
It's terrifyingly potent. Toxicology reports indicate it is roughly 200 times more powerful than morphine.
Wow.
It acts on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the central nervous system. In high doses, it causes rapid muscle paralysis, violent seizures, respiratory failure, and eventually the heart just stops.
Which, if we look back at the accounts from 2024, that lines up with the description of his death.
It lines up disturbingly well. The convulsions, the sudden loss of consciousness, it fits the profile of a powerful neurotoxin. And that leads to the conclusion of the Allied report.
The means, motive, and opportunity line, right?
Exactly. They stated, and this is a direct quote, only the Russian state had the means, motive, and opportunity to deploy this lethal toxin in such a controlled environment.
Now, we have to be rigorous here. This is a report from Western governments who have been at odds with Moscow for years. What is the Russian response to these allegations?
Predictably, they have dismissed it entirely. The Kremlin's response has been consistent with their previous denials regarding the 2020 poisoning.
Okay.
Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokeswoman, issued a statement calling the report feeble-mindedness of Western fabulists.
Fabulists. That's a strong word.
It is. and a planned provocation. Their official stance remains that Navalny died of natural causes or sudden death syndrome, and they argue that without Russian experts verifying the samples, the Western report is legally void. They view this as a PR campaign.
Sudden death syndrome is a very broad diagnosis for a 47-year-old man who, despite prison conditions, appeared healthy in court just the day before.
It is.
So let's bring this all together. What does this mean? We have a man who started by asking about oil receipts and ended up dead in the Arctic from an Amazonian frog toxin.
It shows the evolution of the Russian state over the last 20 years. It moved from a managed democracy where dissent was tolerated within limits to a system that requires total silence. Navalny broke the silence. He laughed at the system. He exposed the mechanics of the corruption.
And most importantly, he built a movement that didn't depend on just him.
Right. Yulia Navalny has certainly proved that. She's carried the torch.
She has. She stepped onto the stage at the Munich Security Conference just hours after the news broke in 2024. She didn't hide. She looked straight at the camera and said Putin would be held personally responsible.
And this report, 2 years later, is part of that accountability.
You know, I keep thinking about the frog.
The frog.
Yeah. Just think about the logistics we discussed. Someone had to authorize this. Someone had to source these specific frogs from Ecuador or Peru or synthesize the toxin in a high-tech lab.
Right.
Then they had to transport it to the most isolated prison on Earth. Then they had to administer it to a man who was already locked in a cage, surrounded by guards, completely cut off from the world.
It is an immense, almost irrational amount of effort.
Exactly. Why go to that trouble? Why use a rare neurotoxin instead of just neglect or something simpler?
Perhaps to send a message to others. We can get you anywhere with anything. Or perhaps paradoxically, they thought it would be untraceable and confuse the exotic for the invisible. But I think it reveals something else.
What's that?
It reveals fear. You don't go to those lengths to kill someone who is irrelevant. You don't import a chemical weapon to the Arctic to silence a blogger unless that blogger terrifies you. The complexity of the murder weapon is a testament to the power of the victim's voice.
That is a powerful thought to leave on. The harder they tried to silence him, the louder the story became.
Indeed. And now, we wait to see how the world and Russia responds to this new truth.